Welcome to the Divine Counsel Worldview Podcast. In this episode, we're going to be handling Genesis 23 and 24. And really, when you think about Genesis 22, last time, the near sacrifice of his son, Abraham, everything that's said about Abraham from here on out could be seen almost as a putting his life in order for him to die. And that's kind of how this is going to go, that we're going to have a burial plot purchased, as it were, for Sarah, and then a bride for Isaac, and then he puts his affairs in order and dies in 25. So coming out of 22, an amazing story that we dealt with last time, we are now putting Abraham's affairs in order in the story. And you mentioned last time, Mike, and I think it'd be good to begin this time with you're noticing in verse 19 of 22:19, that the text has Abraham returning by himself, even though the text had made careful point that they both went up together on the mountain. So let's begin this episode with your thoughts there, because I found them interesting.
So I think the reason I noticed this is because years ago, back in 2012, there was an article that I read that was from the Times of Israel, and the title was very provocative. It was simply "When Abraham Murdered Isaac," and it goes with a New York scholar. I think I forget which university he's from, but his contention from one variant reading of this was that Abraham did go through with the sacrifice of Isaac, and there was no messenger of Yahweh to stop it, and thus he thinks the artifact of this proof is still there in verse 19. I don't agree, but I think it's interesting that a lot of people have wondered, why is it that Abraham is, like, the narrator goes to the point of saying that Abraham came back by himself. Mm-hmm. I would then immediately turn back to some of the thoughts from Dr. Middleton in his book Abraham's Silence. He points this out as well, that it's strange that he is coming down by himself back to the Nahar, to the men that were waiting at the bottom of the mountain. It seems to be that this is intentionally showing something about Abraham and Isaac's relationship, because interestingly enough, and we'll notice this as we go through the other chapters, this appears to be the last time Abraham and Isaac ever actually converse, at least in the narrative stories of the biblical text. We don't ever see them interact or actually having a dialogue with each other. Abraham doesn't even have a chance to even bless Isaac before he dies. He gives Isaac everything he has, but he never actually blesses Isaac because they're not in physical proximity to each other. One final thing, and we'll see this as we get into the later chapters, Middleton, I never noticed it because I'm terrible with geography. But one thing that was very interesting is that Abraham goes to Beersheba. When Sarah later passes away, she's at Hebron. Right. Isaac is at Bir Lalaroi. Right. They're at three different locations. Yep. They're not with each other. And the family apparently has split, or they're no longer with each other after this chapter.
Isaac lives apparently with Ishmael and Hagar at Beer Lalaroi, as you mentioned, and this is all coming up in 2462. Since you mentioned it, 2462, Isaac came his way from the way of Beer Lalaroi. Yeah, he doesn't live with Abraham. I don't know what to make of that, but it's interesting. I'm glad you brought it up. It is interesting that they don't live together.
Yeah, and so that's a little bit of what is so strange. And later on, there's the book, right, from Middleton is called Abraham's Silence. I think he also could have put as a subtitle the passivity or the silence or the passivity of Isaac, because there's something strange also going on with Isaac in that the way that the text is framed, it almost seems like Isaac's at the center, but everything's always being done to him.
Right. Isaac is a very passive character in the story. You're very right about that.
And
that's really going to bring us into our story today. Yeah.
Yeah. Even later on, he is passive. And Middleton, I think part of what clinched it, at least for me, that I think Middleton's onto something, is that even when Jacob later in the story, right, as we're moving through the story, when Jacob reflects on his father and even how his father would describe Yahweh, he described the God of his dad, his father, Abraham, as the terror.
The fear of Isaac. Yeah.
Yeah. Milton asks the question, from this incident, what does Isaac learn about Yahweh? Just as much as what was Abraham supposed to learn from this moment of sacrificing and being stopped about Yahweh?
Well, from everything we can tell, and this is a good introduction now to our story today, Isaac becomes a worshiper of the same deity that Abraham had. And that's a hugely important point to catch because what I've been maintaining in our time together, Mike, as you've heard, is that the Bible is about which God, which Elohim, and that the pages as we turn them, even through Genesis, are answering that question. It's not answering sin management questions or even Messiah questions quite commonly. It's answering the question, which deity, whether it's created the world, which deity runs the story, or which deity I as a person should worship. So that's going to be I would recommend, and hopefully I'm not going to be charged with looking for verses that do this as much as I would recommend. The text is underhandedly saying it in so many ways, but we've often just missed it. So that's where I'm going to go with it today. So 23 and 24 is our theme, but at the end of 22, we didn't read this last time, verses 20 to 24. I won't read them all, but what it is, I'll start it. Now it came to pass after these things, 22:20, that it was told Abraham, saying, indeed, Milcah also has borne children to your brother Nahor. Now, Nahor is Abraham's brother, last mentioned in 11:29. And then it gives the eight children that are born to Nahor, Abraham's brother. And the important verse, the operative verse, is 23. Bethuel, would be a nephew of Abraham, begot Rebekah. So now we're setting up 23 and 24 when we get a bride for Isaac, because we're going to meet a woman named Rebekah, and the person reading it or hearing it will say, oh yeah, that's right. We heard about Rebekah, Abraham's nephew's daughter, back here at the end of 22. So that's the purpose of this pericope, apparently, is just to get us introduced to this woman named Rebekah.
Yeah.
23, let's get into that. I'm not going to read it for sake of time. And again, the purpose of our podcast, when you think about it, we're trying to do a divine counsel, thought experiment through the text. We're not trying to be unfair to it at all. I think, again, my recommendation is that this is how the original reader would have been looking at the text. And so when I say I'm not reading it, I just mean I don't have more to add to it than a good study Bible probably would hand any of us in our read of the text. But Sarah dies in verse 2. I'll start in verse 1. Sarah lived 127 years. Abraham will live in 175. So Sarah dies well before Abraham does. Mm-hmm. Verse 2, she died in Kiriath Arba, that is in Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And what happens is then, and I can summarize the story of 23, he realizes he does not own property. Remember, Abraham is a resident alien. The phrase in verse 4 is, and he's speaking to Hittites or Hethites in verse 3, which just seems to be a people group living in Canaan at the time. Verse 4, I am a foreigner and a sojourner among you. Give me property. So the quick story that we've been reading through the whole time is that Abraham is not an owner of a house and land. He is a renter. He has been sojourning. He's a resident alien. So he has no land rights. And the way a person dies in the ancient world is so important, not just the way, but how you bury them. So he wants to do justice to this woman that he greatly loves, and he wants to give her a proper burial. And so the story of verses 5 and on are basically they want to give him the land and for this burial plot, but Abraham does not want it to be said that it was a gift. So he says, I will pay, verse 9, full price. Mm-hmm. They go back and forth on that price, and by the time we get down to verse 15, we hear that he gives them 400 shekels of silver. We're not sure how to compare market price at this point, in history, obviously. It is interesting in Jeremiah 32 that Jeremiah pays 17 shekels for a smaller piece of land for a burial plot. So the idea that 400 is put in the text seems to be making, or it was there for us in verse 15 to shock the reader. Like, whoa, 400 shekels. And of course, Abraham is a rich man. So he's overpaying. I think what we could say is from verses 1 to 15, we're getting the point of a story of a man who loves his wife so much that in that culture, and I think this would count for ours. We buried my wife's mother last year, and sitting in the funeral or sitting at the cemetery talking to the person who would be in charge of the burial plot and of the tombstone, going through that hours of conversation with other family members there as well. This is a time when you revere, well, is that a strong word? When you appreciate a person and what you pay for and what it looks like on the tombstone and all, the calligraphy of the tombstone, it came down to that level. How are we going to do what names, what words do we put on there? It's indicative of love, frankly. And so this is the kind of story that's meant to pull out the emotion of a man who loves his wife dearly and just pays probably an exorbitant amount for that field. So nothing really divine counsel issue about that. But anyway, yeah, go ahead, Mike.
I'm just reading this note from the study Bible from Walton and Keeger, the NIV Cultural Backgrounds Bible. So he mentions that 400 shekels, that equals to about 10 pounds of silver.
Wow.
And that typically on average, the average wage was 10 shekels of silver per year. He doesn't know whether the price that Abraham paid really was under, decent, or over, but it is still a significant amount of silver. It's a huge amount of silver. Mm-hmm. And so that is, I think goes backing up to your point that this is almost like an expression of the love that he had for this woman.
Yeah. That,
whatever the price, fine. We'll settle on 400, but it's like 10 pounds of silver.
Yeah. I was, and I'm reminded of this in our, in a ancient world study I was taking. It's the Great Courses series. You can get these, online or by DVD and listen to professors from around the world teach, and all for free. And one of them was on the life of the ancient, whether it be Mesopotamian or Roman or Greek or whatever. And it was just fun to listen to his historian's view of life. And at one point he made the comment, and I'll remember taking this away from hours of otherwise pretty boring conversation, but he said, if we think, as is often presumed, that women were treated as chattel in the ancient world, I would like to disagree. He said the evidence from inscriptions and especially from funerary or things put on tombstones. What's the equivalent of tombstones to us today? He said, when you read them, you are amazed quite often as to the love and the honor that these men had for their wives quite often. Yeah. So, things said about, I can't live without you. And the equivalent of this sort of sentiment that his call, and I forget the teacher of this course, but again, he's just a secular professor at a university. His point was, we need to stop this idea that women were treated poorly in the ancient world. And, from our vantage point, maybe they were. Let's say they couldn't vote or something like that, in the ancient world. The point is, though, if you want to get into the emotion of these peoples, from everything we can tell, the love of husband for wife was equal, if not greater, then than it is now. So it was interesting that he made that call from a secular vantage point and not even from a religious one. So when I read this story, I'm meant to appreciate the love that Abraham had for Sarah, his wife. She went through a lot, right? I mean, think through her life, barren for 25 years, sending away Hagar, her concubine, in 21, losing her, well, I guess stepson, Ishmael, to all that. I mean, it's just messy to some degree, but also a life well lived. And notice again, if I may say so, the story of Sarah is not about sin management. We have nothing about her, how God handled Sarah's sins. I think it's a story of obviously love, number one, but number two, the lack of attention drawn to that sort of model of imputed righteousness, blah, 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 is meant to be, in my mind, part of what I'm supposed to catch out of stories like this. That we don't have to resort to some sort of salvational mechanics that gets into that, when really all we have is a story of probably a woman who was as Yahwistic as her father, as her husband, and is to be revered that way. So, and that's what I want to get to in verse 18 actually. To Abraham as a possession, the land was deeded there. So he owns this land near Hebron. And after this, verse 19, Abraham buried Sarah, his wife, in the cave of the field of Machpelah before Mamre, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And by the time the biblical story ends, Old Testament story, we'll have Abraham buried there, Sarah, of course, Isaac, Jacob, Rebekah, and Leah. All six will be buried in this cave. And so today, there is a building built over that cave by Herod the Great 2,000 years ago that's still there. And it's I think I even have the dimensions written somewhere here. I do not. It's just a block of a building. I mean, it's not that architecturally appealing, but it's still there. And if you are on a tour to Israel and you have a guide that's gutsy and doesn't mind going into Palestinian territory where rocks may be thrown at your bus. Well, last time I was there, that's what happened. We pull into Hebron and here come the stones, because they know it's it's a bus full of Christians and Jews. So then you get out though, and you can go in, and now it's a mosque, so you have to be, you're told where you can and cannot go. But that is a building that still reveres the burial place of four patriarchs and two women. No, I'm sorry, three patriarchs and three wives. Anyway, anything you want to add to 23? Otherwise, I have no more to say about 23.
It's just simply, like all this discussion I know I've been bringing up, like from Middleton, whatever else. But I remember years ago, one of our associate pastors at my church, she did something that later on I actually had to learn this past cohort on how to do a first person narrative sermon.
Okay.
And she did it as speaking from the perspective of Sarah. And it was actually the first time I ever even heard this possible idea. I didn't realize it until she did it in her first person narrative of that Abraham and Sarah were no longer living together after what happened with Isaac. And this was way before Middleton's book ever came out. It was before I even ever had a clue of like some of this weird stuff that's happening in the story. But she spoke from the perspective of Sarah and of not knowing, like, wait, where did they go? like they went to do a sacrifice. Why wasn't I told? And eventually, like sort of the reaction of Sarah finding out, you did what? You tried to do what? And so anyways, it was an interesting kind of exploration.
I like that.
Yeah, it was an interesting exploration. And so that's partly why when I was reading Middleton's book, it threw me back into that, because I never noticed that weird ambiguity and the fact that they were not living in the same location when she died. And so
if we're going to take the end of 22, he's in Beersheba, and then 23, she dies in Hebron. So
and apparently Abraham stays at Beersheba, because by the time he does pass away, like Isaac heads up to Beersheba.
Right.
And so
I forget the verse, but you are right.
So it's interesting. It's just weird, right? And so that's why I do think there is something that partly why I appreciated Middleton's work, because it's just good old fashioned exegetical work, noticing the text in weird spots of like, what is happening? I know I never noticed it just because I know I'm pretty bad at noticing geography points. And just the fact that they are at different locations. So it's like a triangle but they're nowhere near each other.
And Mike, thank you for bringing this up. I had not thought of it either. My quick response would be, or possible answer would be, Abraham has, notice of 25:1, a concubine by the name of Keturah. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that's the first time. In other words, probably we're having polygamy going on here. Sarah, of course, is the first wife, the loved wife, things like that. But there's probably other women involved. And thus, Abraham is part of a farming tribe that literally spreads out over various parts of the southern Negev there. And maybe at that point, Sarah wasn't even living with Abraham. It's very possible that the tribe had grown to that size, or the clan. But
possibly.
Interesting ideas. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. So 23, I'm going to let go. And it moved. That's Sarah's death. So Sarah has died. And before, and just so, again, the reader is put into a context of timing, when you get to 25:1, Abraham again took a woman, and her name was Keturah. And then she's called a concubine in verse 6. So the point being that Abraham is without a wife now, apparently, but we're not sure exactly how long. And then he will marry again, or again, he may have had Keturah during that time. We're not sure. So anyway, the timing is not given to us explicitly. But what does happen is 24. And this is the story of the search for, as your study Bibles will often have a title to your chapter. Mine reads, A Bride for Isaac. So Isaac is an interesting person because he is kind of in that middle ground between Abraham and Jacob. More is said about Abraham and Jacob, of course, than is ever said about Isaac. He's a quiet person, and yet at the same time, here's again that theme coming out, the which Elohim question is interestingly part of his life. And so clearly by the time you get to the end in New Testament, by the way, if you look up the word Isaac in the New Testament, its use is almost always dedicated to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So he fits in between two other Yahwists. And my suspicions are, based on our story today in 24, and how his reputation builds through the rest of Scripture, is that he was a consummate Yahwist. He never wavered in his worship of one deity alone, that deity being the creator of the earth. So to me, that's the takeaway of the life of Isaac as opposed to Ishmael. And we'll get back to Ishmael because the genealogy will lead us in that direction. So I would say, if there is just if you're preaching through Isaac and or this story at all, and you're wondering what do I emphasize for my audience, I would say the God of Isaac versus the God of Ishmael. To me, there's going to be a clear difference, and no better difference than on October 7th, 2023, when Hamas raids Israel. Those are Arabs killing Jews. Guess which boys they both go back to? An Arab in the Quran and in all tradition of the Arab world. Muslims look to Ishmael for their leadership. Jews look to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So the question of Isaac and Ishmael is the which God question. And here we go with the Isaac side of that story, which thus 24:1 now makes great sense. Abraham, verse 1, was old, well advanced in age, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. Yahweh blessed him. So there's the which God answer. Who was blessing Abraham? Yahweh. So Abraham said to his oldest servant, we're never given a name in our story, but Eliezer is mentioned in 15:2, and the tradition of the Jews is that Eliezer is the named servant who is taking this role of finding a bride for the boy. Abraham said to his oldest servant, who ruled over all that he had, please put your hand under my thigh. Now, this would be a cultural way of making a promise, and that might be, euphemistic for something more uncomfortable. And the idea is, I am putting my hand where I don't normally put it. I'll never forget that I made this promise. And if I don't keep my end. May you do to me what I'm doing to you, kind of a symbol. So that's kind of what's going on. Very, very, very cultural. Nothing that God, of course, commanded here, but this is just how cultures made promises at that time. And I will make you swear by it. Again, catch the witch god here. I will make you swear by Yahweh, the Elohim of heaven, and the Elohim of the earth, just in case you wonder who he is, that you may not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I dwell. And of course, Deuteronomy 7, looking ahead, but importantly, lists these Canaanite places as non-Yahwists, and that's the point. So I think what he's simply saying in verse 3 is, you are, because you're my head servant, I've given to you everything I have, as it were, or you rule my household. You're not my son, but you're my servant. But I, by the name of Yahweh, who happens to be the God of everything, I want you to go get a son who is going to be representative of this kind of theology. I want him to have the same God I do. And the place to not get a wife, if you want to find a wife who doesn't believe in that God, well, you go to the people from Canaan, among whom I dwell. I'm forecasting. Look at 36. I want to do it now. I think I do. Let me forecast something. 36, 1 and 2. This is the genealogy of Esau. Esau will be a son, of course, of Isaac. Who is Edom? Esau took wives, as opposed to 24:1. Esau in 36:2, it says, took wives from the daughters of Canaan. There it is. How do you know which God a person worships? I know the text can be very clear. He builds an altar and calls upon the name of Yahweh. That's probably the best way to know. A second, or a close second or third, is listen to the story tell of where he gets his wife from. And so Esau will be a guy who clearly, just goes off to Canaan and finds wives there, and that's going to be his inheritance in the sense of which God I believe he's going to follow as well. So that's the background of 24:3. Yeah, I was going to go ahead, Mike.
So I wanted to mention earlier, like it is interesting about the whole entire moment with, the servant, probably Eliezer, put your hand under my thigh, as the ESV would say it. There's an interesting note. I think Walton thinks that this could possibly be a euphemism of like that, the using of the more private regions of a guy. It's interesting that no one really knows for sure, but I do wonder, and this is part of my own personal speculation, is this like an ancient Near Eastern way of saying, literally, my prodigy, like my descendants are in your hands. And that, like,
I read that in another commentary. Yeah.
Like this job, this task I'm giving you is so important. Literally, if I'm going to have 8 descendants, it's in your hands. And
I'm so glad we don't live in that world.
I know.
Now we sign contracts, right? And I like that. So, but yeah, it's amazing.
It's just an interesting little visual kind of, and I like how you said it. It's like, you're never going to forget that you made this agreement.
Right. When you think about the signing on the dotted line, that's very British. It comes because of the idea of, we now read and write. What do you call that? I'm literate. And because I'm literate now, I can sign. And now if I couldn't sign, remember what you do is write an X. You draw an X, and that was your signature. And I bring all that up because I just noticed in the Bible, and I think we should do this with our biblical reading in general, go back in time. Don't take your culture back there. Let their culture be their culture. So C.S. Lewis, I think I give the illustration where he says, when you go visiting another country, it's easy to bring England with you and be upset by the kind of hotel you're in there in France that you don't like because you're comparing it to what you had in England. Or he says you can go to France and enjoy French hotels for what they are and come back a different person. And I like that point that when you go to the Bible, do not bring American Western thinking with you, because it will be weird right up front and you're not going to know what's going on. Whereas just enjoy going to another world. It's well before your own, and do things that are weird, but they're not weird. To them, they're not weird. So a guy grabs his Yeah, well, there we go. So
Yeah.
that's verse 2. A man grabs his chief servant and says, now you swear. Of course, what's the answer going to be? You swear by Yahweh that you're not going to get a son or a bride that's not a Yahwist. That's how I read verse 3. I need a Yahwist girl, and the only place to get that is to verse 4, go to my country and my kindred. And we learn that that's in verse 10, the city of Nahor, which is Paddan Aram. So it's well north, and that's the land where his family is apparently, and that's the beauty of the story, is you're going to learn through it that he's going to meet up with Yahwists along the way. In that sense, I can kind of hurry through the verses because I don't need to read them. But he sends him out. Verse 7 is interesting. The Lord God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my kindred, and who spoke to me and swore to me, this is Isaac talking. Abraham. I'm sorry. Abraham's talking. Mm-hmm. Then he quotes the story, to your descendants I will give this land. Then Abraham says to Eliezer, he, Yahweh, will send his messenger before you, and you shall take a wife for my son from there. So again, don't read angel there, read messenger. The question, and by the way, if you go to verse 40 of the same chapter, which is retelling the story, Yahweh before whom I walk will send, just retelling the story, his messenger with you and prosper your way. So twice in the story, we have a note of a messenger going with Eliezer to help him. And do I want to, is this a human messenger or a divine messenger, i.e. angel? I could go either way. What's interesting is that messenger is not a common word in Genesis. We're going to have in 28, the next time we have messenger showing up is 28:12, and they're called specifically messengers of Elohim. So that's why we think that these are divine beings in 28:12. That's the latter story. 31:11, 32:1. Again, it says messengers of the Elohim. So we probably would take that to be divine beings. And then in 32:3 and 32:6, they're clearly human because Jacob will send them to Esau as though they're his guys. So I just take those as human. And then we have one more messenger mentioned in 48:6, where Jacob makes this interesting comment in his dying statements that Yahweh took care of me, his messenger took care of me, as though Jacob remembers in his life a messenger. And we'll get there and make our comments on that then. But the point is that these messengers show up every now and then, as we've seen. We always have the right to ask, is this human or divine? And in this case, I don't know. My text, and I'm sure yours, all the English texts we have 24:7 and 24:40 using the word angel. But that's a translational decision on the part of the editor. All right. Go ahead.
I think, though, it might be worth saying just simply, like, as you mentioned, like this word is not often very much used in Genesis. And that, the most prominent example being used last time was that whole moment of Isaac and Abraham. And so I do wonder, as I'm listening to the story, would I just naturally unless I'm told explicitly that these were guys, like human beings, that I almost would hear the word malak, like Melakim, and then sort of make the connection back to like, well, if it's coming from Yahweh, if it's coming from an Elohim, then possibly this is a divine being or a spiritual being, more likely.
Yeah. Well, and if a listener wants to look at this, here's where it becomes a challenge. 32, I know it's ahead of the story, but let's go to it. 32:1. Jacob went on his way, and Malakim of Elohim met him. That of Elohim seems to drive the idea that these messengers must be divine. So my version, I have New King James here, 32:1, it reads, so Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. And I would read this, my recommendation would be, I would read it as, and this is how my mind works. So Jacob went on his way, and divine beings of Elohim met him, divine messengers. So they're, if you want to call them angels again, people do that, but I'm just thinking he meets these interesting people or interesting beings, and that's what draws him to verse 2 when he says, this is an Elohim camp. That's why it's so weird. He says, Jacob saw them. He said, this is God's or an Elohim camp. And he called the name of that place Mahanaim. But look at verse 3. Then Jacob sent, and my Bible has messengers there.
Yeah.
But it could be angels because that's the same word, Malachim. So Jacob sent Malachim before him to Esau, his brother, in the land of Seir. It's just interesting that in 32:3, if those are humans, and if 32:1 is divine, those words are played literally right next to each other in the same story. Or is the reader given the impression that Jacob meets these odd divine beings, and then he sends some of them, verse 3, to Esau? Again, and then it's repeated in verse 6. So it's just weird that word messenger, Malachim, gets tossed back and forth in the Old Testament between angel and messenger. In the New Testament, the same with angelos. We have Paul sending angeloi, to different people that are not divine beings. So it just, back to that same old thing we've been talking about. Be careful with angels, that we turn them into some kind of being that Dante knew more than we do. So,
yeah, actually, this is actually kind of a funny thing in my mind. I'm almost picturing that these messengers of God, they're probably presenting themselves looking like, if these are divine beings, they probably look human at that moment. And
yeah, there's a camp of them. So what
yeah,
they're
there's
doing,
a camp.
I have no idea.
And so it's weird to me. It's like, so how did that conversation go? If the messengers in verse 3 are the same messengers from verse 1, did he actually hey, can you do me a favor?
Right.
You're way stronger than a normal human being. Can you go and talk to Esau? Because I'm afraid
Esau
to really
and I have our
meet up
troubles.
with him.
I'd like you to go talk to him. It's very possible that these beings that are being sent in 3 are the same as the ones in 1. And if so, that's weird. But the text kind of slips by us because it calls one an angel and the other a messenger, which, again, is unfair to the English-speaking person. Back to 24. Yeah, back to 20. And this is a Divine Counsel Worldview podcast, so we get to look at that. That's the point. 24:10, the servant took 10 of his master's camels and departed, for all his master's goods were in his hand, and he arose and went to Mesopotamia, to the city of Nahor. Again, we learned that that's Padam Aram, and it's up in the northern part of the Levant. So it's a month, probably, of travel. And I'm not going to read it, but he again brings his camels into a town. He says to himself in verse 14, if she says, drink, and I will also give your camels a drink. The key word being also. He's waiting for a sign. Is there anything wrong with this? To ask God, this messenger probably, he was talking to the messenger the whole time, saying, well, I need help here. Here's what we'll do. How about this? In fact, in verse 12, O Yahweh Elohim of my master Abraham. So he seems to be worshiping the same deity as his master, and he leans on that deity for support in this sense. I need a sign. Is there anything wrong with that? You have a lot of sign giving in the Old Testament, and what I find interesting is that you never have a moralistic, he should have, he shouldn't have kind of comment made by the narrator. So whether Gideon or here, when a man says to Yahweh, through a messenger, here's what I need or want. I think personally, this is my personal call, Mike, I don't see a problem with it. I have a friend, in fact, who went to Gordon Conwell. You didn't know him because he went years before you got there. The way he decided his seminary, he was telling me this when I was living in California. He was looking for a seminary to go to. He put the names of, I think, 3 or 4, Westminster, Dallas, Gordon Conwell, and one other one, Princeton, in a hat, literally. And he prayed and said, God, I'm going to pull one out because they're all fine for me, what I want to do. And he pulled out Gordon Conwell. And so he has a degree from Gordon, and he lives in the Boston area to this day. And wonderful Christian gentleman. And what do you think of that?
I want to say praise the Lord.
I know, because he went to Gordon. And but the point being, it's interesting again that we want to moralize these kind of stories and make that the point of the sermon. Should I, shouldn't I? When really the story of the Bible is, which God do you worship? And if you worship him, everything will be well. And you may have conversations with that deity that are extremely personal. And I have a friend even that tells the story of he was at the bottom of the well. He had been unfaithful to his wife and was living alone up in Canada. And he went out one night and just threw his heart up to the Lord, said, I can't go on. And he looked up, and again, we take this story as just whatever, but he said a shooting star, brilliant light across the sky. I mean, that lasts like 2 seconds, but to this day, he's retired now and a delightful, godly man back with his wife. But he got that moment of an answer, not because the Bible said you can do that, but because his relationship to God was that way, where he needed something. And that need came out in an emotional appeal. And in his mind, and I'm agreeing with him, God answered that appeal. So that's what I take this to be, is that after a long, tiring trip, Eliezer turns to the right God and says, I need help, and says, I need the word also. And so then he meets verse 15. It happened before he had finished speaking that, behold, Rebekah, this would again be the second cousin of Isaac, because again, Abraham's brother Nahor had a son who then had a daughter. So that's one generation. So, you can do the math, but it's a second cousin. It's one generation down on the cousin scale from Isaac. She's a young woman in verse 16, probably 20-ish. We're going to learn that Isaac's 40, and this is a generation down, so probably 20-ish. Beautiful woman. No man had been with her. And then what she says in verse 19 is the catch word, also. So I draw a line between verse 14 and 19, grabbing two words, same word twice, also. When she says also the camels, she hastens, and the man, verse 21, remains silent as to know whether the Lord had made his journey prosperous. I think he was just stunned by, again, how God answered his prayer, akin to a shooting star. Nose ring in verse 22, in case anyone wants to have a nose ring. There's your biblical justification. They put a nose ring on her. And verse 26, don't miss this. The man bowed his head and worshipped which God? Telling you again where we're going with this story. And verse 27 I love because, again, even though a messenger, whoever that messenger was, notice who gets the credit. Verse 27, blessed be Yahweh, God of my master Abraham, who has not forsaken his mercy and his truth toward my master. As for me being on the way, Yahweh led me to the house of my master's brethren. So he gives credit to Yahweh. 29, Rebekah had a brother whose name was Laban. Don't forget him. And again, he's introduced to the story now because he will play a huge role later. That's the brother. Notice he is a Yahwist. How do you know? Verse 31. He said, come in, O blessed of Yahweh. Again, this whole story, by the way, I should honor what we're going to meet in Exodus 6. And I know Mike, Dr. Heiser was all about this too. You've got this question running parallel to the biblical story right now is, what is Yahweh's name, or what's God's name? And we're not going to be introduced officially to Yahweh as a name until Exodus 6, when Moses is on the backside of the desert. He sees that burning bush and so forth. And that's, again, 500 years from now. So the question of how do you get Yahweh's name backfitted into a story like this would be, in my estimation, and take your shot at it too if you want to, Mike. The editor is putting it in. In other words, we learn his name later in the story, and we're going to go back and put it in. So if I was listening to the actual language of Laban, Rebekah, Eliezer, whatever at this point, I would not have heard the 4 letters of the Tetragrammaton being spoken. I would have heard, an ancient language, Akkadian or something like that, that is leaning into Proto-Hebrew maybe and things like that. And who knows what names were used or even descriptions of Yahweh at this point. But it wasn't the name Yahweh. That's the point.
I'm curious. So regarding that, I did agree with you, I think previously a few months ago. And then ironically, my head has been spinning because recently on the other podcast I helped co-host on Ask a Scholar, we had Dr. Carmen Imes.
Oh, okay.
And so we got to that question of the divine name. And she referenced to us the work of T. Desmond Alexander.
Okay.
And I think it was the Apollo commentary. Through the actual looking at the Hebrew grammar and the wording, he contends that the patriarchs, and in that time, they actually did know the name of Yahweh.
Okay.
And
I know it is debated, so yeah.
Yeah, it is up for debate, and he proposes that a possible way of translating, and I guess this is the way that Carmen is going towards with her own commentary work and her own translation, is that when God is speaking to Moses and talking about his name, it's not so much of that Abraham and the patriarchs did not know his name, but it was actually more of like a rhetorical question. Did not Abraham know my name?
Oh, okay.
And so it was a very interesting kind of twist that, and there is good, like actual like Hebrew grammar work being done there. That there is that question. Is it actually more of a question, like a rhetorical question? Did they not know my name? And so thus it would make sense narratively that when Moses comes back, it heads back to the Israelites in Egypt, and they're wondering like, okay, are you sure? Like who gave you this message to deliver us, to take us out of Egypt? Well, it's Yahweh. Oh, yes, we know who Yahweh is. That because this is a name that they have been familiar with as a people.
Yeah, well, and thank you. And so for our purposes here, we could agree, and I'm sure Carmen would be here and Dr. Alexander would say the same. What words were coming out of their mouth were not English, obviously. They weren't even Hebrew probably at this point. So they must have been a language in which, now the question comes in, does the 4 letters of the Tetragrammaton fit there? And if they did, that's cool. And if I'm wrong, if I find out I'm wrong, I'd be more than happy to, oh, good. They did have Yahweh's name on their lips. That would be cool too. But somehow they agree on a descriptor or a name that fits our story so that we now know we can go back in and put the name Yahweh there. That's, I think, what we have to say. Good. Thank you. So 31, the point being, he is a Yahwist. Laban is, O blessed of Yahweh. At least he respects the God that Eliezer worships. The man comes in the house, unpacks the camels, and then look at 33. The food was set before him to eat. He said, I will not eat until I have told you about my errand. And he said, speak on. And I wrote in my Bible, here we go again, smiley face. And the entire story is repeated. Everything you had from verses 1 pretty much to now is simply, we swing back and we have Eliezer tell the story from his vantage point, including verse 40, the angel or the messenger who goes before him. And 48, I bowed my head and worshipped Yahweh, blessed the Yahweh God of my master Abraham, who had led me in the way of truth. So he repeats that. And now we bring it back into the story. Now, if you will deal kindly and truly with my sister. Oh, the word truly, interesting. 49, if you will deal kindly and truly. Emet in Hebrew often has the word true attached to it in English, but very commonly, and I find it here as well, the connotation of true or truly has reference to a promise being kept. So be watching for that as you read your Bible, folks, that when you see the word true God or truly, something like that, a derivation of the Hebrew word emet, you're probably referencing the honorific idea that Yahweh keeps his promises. So he deals kindly and truly with my master, tell me.
In Hallett, the major Hebrew lexicon dictionary. One other way of translating that would be, according to them, is trustworthiness.
Okay, cool.
Faithfulness. Like there's a solidity, there's a solidarity almost element to this.
Yeah. Notice how truly in English doesn't catch that. We think in terms of 2 and 2 equals truly, the word, the number 4, but to them it had a concept of loyalty. Cool. Verse 50. Now here's where we again answer the question of which God. Then Laban, that's the son, and Bethuel, that's the dad, answered and said, the thing comes from Yahweh. We cannot speak to you either good or bad. And I circled that verse and I wrote the word Yahwists right next to it. So now we know that the answer to the beginning of the chapter is in front of us, that Abraham wanted a Yahwistic wife for his son, and he got it because we have in verse 50 the 2 men, the son and the dad, honoring not just the idea of God, this is Elohim, Yahweh. Here is Rebekah before you, 51, take her and go, let her be your master's son. So they say it's fine. Now the question will still have to be answered by her in time. It came to pass when Abraham's servant heard their words, notice what happens again, that he worshipped Yahweh, bowing himself to the earth. Then the servant brought out jewelry of silver, gold, and so forth, gave them to Rebekah. Here's the dowry. In case of divorce in the ancient world, a dowry is still used today many times in the ancient or third world. A dowry is what you give to a woman in case of divorce, that she gets to keep that at least, even if she loses what her husband had. And he gave precious things to her brother and to her mother. So that's why they do that. And they eat and drink, and they decide, should we leave right away? I forget the verse that we're finding that, how soon they should leave. But they finally say, let's go. Verse 58. Will you go with this man? Often in the ancient world, again, we think that the woman was at the behest of the husband, that you've got to go. But you often see the woman being the clutch and the man being the gas. So he asks and she complies. And they went away. They sent away Rebekah, their sister, and her nurse, and Abraham's servant and his men. So the story has a happy, successful ending in a sense. In 59, as they send her out, they kind of repeat 22:17 by saying, the gates of those who hate you, you will possess them someday. That's the prayer they give to their sister or to Rebekah, is that may your descendants be in charge of vast estates of cities by being in charge of the gates, as it were. 62. Here they finally then come upon Isaac. Now Isaac came from the way of Beer Lahai Roy, for he dwelt in the south, that's near Kadesh. It's where Hagar and Ishmael were, from 1614. The last we heard about Ishmael and Hagar, they were living in chapter 16, verse 14 in this city. So he may have been living with them and not with Abraham. And Isaac went out to meditate in the field. He lifted his eyes and looked, the camels were coming. Rebekah lifted her eyes. And he saw her. It is my master. She took the veil and covered herself. 65. And the servant told Isaac all the things that had been done. And we end with Isaac brought to, this is a summary statement. He brings her into his mother's tent. And he took Rebekah, and she became his wife. All that is symbolic for marrying a woman. So, I will do this. Yeah, let me just say then again, as I close this podcast, that, there's no sin management issues here. Again, no rituals. Sacrifice, if there is one, it's not for expiation of sins. This notion that, why do people sacrifice? I understand that when we get into Leviticus, we're going to have a lot of things to talk about, but what we're seeing in this kind of a story, as ancient as it is getting along with, and I'm going to choose my words really carefully, Mike. So I long for your response, good or bad. Getting along with Yahweh has never been difficult, in the sense that I'm learning, if I was reading this, experiencing this story, I would say to myself, okay, he's a God who wants my everything. I mean, he may ask me to kill my son. So I shouldn't say it's easy. But getting along with him doesn't require me to be sinless. I don't have to sacrifice for my sins, apparently. I don't see any evidence of that. I don't have to do anything except, but here comes a huge except, give him everything. It's like a dog. If you ask my dog, is it hard to be loyal to Ron? I got a little 5-pound Yorkie. He would say no, but it takes everything. I mean, I have to give him the right to be fed at certain times, to be taken outside at certain times. In a sense, you could say a dog's response to the master would be, it's very easy to be loyal, but it takes everything I have. And I would say that's what I'm getting up to chapter 24 of Genesis. If I'm following the story, leaning into the story, trying to figure out what is the story doing, where's it going, I would say, again, I long for your response as we close this podcast, Mike. The God of these people, whatever his name is, whether they know it's Yahweh or not, the God of these people claims to be the creator of the world and heaven and earth. He runs the place. He runs everything about my world, and he wants me. And that's about it. I don't have any other requirements besides giving him my thoughts, my love, my hopes, my fears. I talk to him like I talk to a messenger on a road, right? That's how even this story goes. I don't know. See, that's why, and I hesitate to talk about what I don't believe, right? But I want to throw it out there, Mike. I just get lost in reading commentaries on Genesis when they want to shove Reformed theology into it already and have Yahweh being a God who needs this, that, and the other. Well, behavioral perfection is usually what's mentioned, or at least, the idea that God is looking for perfection until he gets it through Jesus. We're going to be in, some kind of a constant. I was reading a commentary the other day and, talking about that the tension of the Old Testament is God's perfection and people living up to that need of perfection and not being able to give it to him. And thus the sacrifices are that way of kind of temporarily bridging that gap between my imperfection and God's perfection. I read that and then I say, no, I've got a story in Genesis that has nothing to do with that at all. If I want to read it into it, have fun. But I don't know. I find value personally in looking at a story for its big picture. And if there's anything I'm getting out of this so far, the story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or Isaac at this point, is I've got a God who's very easy to please, but he wants everything I have. How's that sound?
I would generally agree with you. And it's interesting, right? We're reading this, and this past week for me personally, like a sister in the faith, she used to go to our church and she's now at a different church right now. But one of the most consistent things within her life for the past couple of years, because she's relatively still a young Christian, is trying to figure out, how do I know this is God's will one way or the other? Is it okay for me to ask a sign? Is it okay for me to ask God to give me some symbol, some way to know? Does he want me to get married or not be married? And those kind of questions of life. And it was very interesting, right? I when you were speaking a little earlier, like, is it right or wrong that Eliezer had, asked this request, like, give me a sign? And I think, like, because of the culture of their day, it made sense. Like, they're not even thinking moralistically. It's like this, like, I'm just trying to discern what is happening. But his affection, his direction is, who is he asking this from, right? He's asking Yahweh, please give me some indication of which way to go, what direction, how do I know which woman? I think sometimes, though, however, when we come to our time era, there may be kind of other suspicious motives that may be coming in, I think. And it's hard for us to separate ourselves at times from that. I think there is something to be said that I do love the fact that the story even points out that he doesn't even get to finish what he is saying. And oh, here comes this young woman.
Man, it even says that
he doesn't even finish
speaking.
what he's about to say.
Yeah.
And I would say also, there's these other things, right? We were even talking earlier about, was this a human messenger? Was this a divine messenger? And yet it is interesting to me that as Eliezer recounts the story, no one ever says anything about like, oh yeah, a person came by, told us that Abraham was looking for a wife. Like, so they don't have in their mind that some sort of physical messenger had come, like some human messenger had come. And yet somehow just the serendipitous timing. And so I do think, it's sort of implied in the story, the messenger is unseen. Like you can't visibly see the messenger, but this messenger is preparing something, is arranging events, or somehow like, hey, like, I don't know why, but I feel like I should drop by the well today.
Yeah, right. That doesn't say that. Yeah.
But all of this is really just like, wow, what a kindness.
Yeah. I've said that to my wife in passing, that I notice it's not my audible voices I hear in my head where I think God shows up for me personally. It's the things he does for me. I read this happens so often, Mike. I'll pull a book off the shelf just on a whim because I'm looking for something, and it happens to be exactly what I need for something I'm studying, that's completely off topic. And that's a simple idea, but those moments of divine serendipity, as you call it there, where something happens and you don't have proof, as though you can take it to an atheist and prove that God exists. But in your heart of hearts, that's a moment where God had to do that. That to me is, that's Genesis 24 in a lot of ways, but that's also 2024 for me, where I live. So.
And, like the last episode, you asked me the question of how my doctorate program was going. It was kind of at the end of those 2 weeks, we had to answer the big question with our overseeing professor. What are you going to work on probably for your dissertation? Oh, like, we don't have to come to a definite like idea, but we're supposed to be making headway right into that. And, I had no idea at the start of it, but I was sharing things about what we had been doing at my church, and even more recently, how I've been talking and going back. The reason why Militan's been on my mind a lot of times is mainly actually because of his work with the book of Job too. And how Job has been a very significant book for me for these last couple of years, especially with everything that has happened with my wife's health, with what happened with my sister, with what happened with Dr. Heiser. So like, I just always kept returning back to that book and always reflecting on the stuff that's in the book of Job, and finding a passion of just like talking about this and talking about the importance of lament, or the importance of imprecatory prayer. And at the beginning of those 2 weeks, I had no clue what I was going to focus on. But by the end of it, it just seemed to make sense as I talked with my cohort mates, as I just kind of reflected on the fact that I keep talking about Job. Maybe my dissertation should have something to do about preaching on Job. And so that's at least the direction I'm heading towards. But it seemed like just through the process of just conversation and just, this seems to mesh well. This seems to be like a direction that for some reason has been going towards in my life. I'm just going to run with it and just see what happens. Yeah.
And I would say, again, pulling all this together, love the right God and everything will be fine. That kind of where you have to land when it comes to not just soteriology, but sanctification in our modern world. That's how I think of it. That's simple. Yeah. And I use the dog laying on my lap as an example. The way things can go well for my little dog, Mandy, is not to go to another house. He's got to come to mine because I'll take care of him. But otherwise, it's pretty simple. All right. Well, thank you. And I think we'll drop it there. That's end of 24. We'll pick it up next time to 25 and 26. And notice, again, the story answering the which Elohim question through both the person of Ishmael and then these boys that are now going to be born into the story called Jacob and Esau. So I think we'll let it go. And thank you, everyone. Until next time, we'll see you then.